Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about Pillars of Eternity and Avowed. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thank you so much for joining me as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for the worlds that Obsidian has created for us. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks everyone for joining me on another episode as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics of Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, gearing up for, well, not the release of Avowed. Man, I went to kind of like muscle memory there. Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 and Avowed, and for those wondering why we're talking about all those games, it's because they all share the same fantasy setting known as Eora. And so if you're new to the show, really happy to have you here. I'll signpost you towards episode 0, where I signpost you further to other topics that are very foundational for the lore of this world if you're wanting to learn the fundamentals. Although today will actually be a really good episode to start off with as well. I don't particularly have a specific topic today, since I am recording this a little earlier than I was anticipating being able to record the next episode. I'm kind of hoping to maybe record 2 topics in a row. So this one is kind of just an off-the-cuff episode. This one's going to have to do a little bit with tabletop role-playing games and injecting an Eora setting into whatever tabletop game it is that you're playing. Obviously, it would have to be something in the kind of fantasy realm, because I've been really getting into tabletop playing again at this point in time. I do kind of want to touch a little bit also on the topic of teleportation, so there will be a little bit of formal lore in today's episode, but that I'll save for a little bit later if I manage to get onto it, because they're kind of related in a way. Hopefully you'll understand a little bit later for now. But yeah, that's what we're going to talk about today. No news to go over other than there's a Grounded 2 update coming up for those who care about Grounded 2 because it's Obsidian related. I definitely am. My crew and I have played Grounded to the point where we've beat the boss, we've got all the stuff, we're kind of just goofing around at this point, but we've built our mega base, our village, we've each built our respective bases, we've built our characters and armors up to what we want, so we're kind of not really chasing any carrots right now in Grounded, so having the next update out will give us something to do, such as get a ladybug mount and defeat the new tarantula boss and stuff like that, other than just looking for raw science and milk molars. But anyways, that's not Eora related, so let's just dive straight into the lore.
Half the locals would arrest you for trespassing and the rest would kill you outright. I'm curious, what exactly did you find there?
So this topic kind of comes about because I've been really getting into a game called Cairn. That's Cairn, not the name Cairn. It's a Cairn, specifically 2nd edition Cairn, but it's technically backwards compatible with 1st edition Cairn. It's just expanded upon a lot more and gives a lot more tools to people who are playing the game and especially GMing the game. It's part of a branch or style of tabletop role-playing in the OSR genre, which stands for Old School Revolution or Renaissance. It's really up for debate. And it's a different way of playing tabletop role-playing games from what people are used to with things like Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, or Pathfinder 2nd edition, or a lot of other tabletop role-playing games of that sort. These OSR-style games are very light on rules. You can summarize a lot of these in just a couple of pages, and the rules are designed like that on purpose because it's very much a rulings over rules kind of game. When you're playing a game like Dungeons & Dragons, there are specific lines drawn in the sand of when you can do this, when you can do that, how far this thing goes, what kind of effects it can have, etc., etc. There are definitive lines drawn in the sand. Whereas with a lot of OSR games, these ones leave rules or spell descriptions purposely vague for the purposes of letting the table kind of decide how they're going to let the thing play out. It's definitely a way of playing that I personally prefer, but I'm not saying it's therefore better. It just depends on what each table really likes. If you have a game like Dungeons & Dragons where each thing is measured out into very minuscule detail, then you know that everyone is overcoming the same standard level of challenge. People are engaging with it in a very much of a gamey kind of process, and there's something to be said about that. right? It makes the difficulty a little more standardized. It means everybody's kind of approaching it from the same perspective in terms of being able to access the same level of mechanics, and it's not up to each person's different creativity, which different players have different skills for. But on the other side, with the OSR genre, it means that the table is really kind of investing themselves more into the actual story and the actual game and the actual characters themselves. And so it really comes down to preference. I like it. I like the rulings over rules kind of thing. I like the focus on the random rolls. I don't know. I'm really into it. And unfortunately, there's a bajillion of these games out, which means my wallet hates me right now. But I'm trying to laser focus just on this one game of Cairn. Now, the reason I bring this up in relation to Eora is because anytime I get into any sort of fantasy RPG, I start to ask, can I inject Eora into this? Because I've spent so much time into this setting. It's one that I'm very familiar with, and it means that I can bring that knowledge to the table in a lot better way when I'm GMing a game. Whereas if I tried to do anything in the Forgotten Realms, I would just be making it up on the spot. I wouldn't have, a lot of lore to offer people because I just don't know a lot about it. The only Dungeons & Dragons world I know anything about is Eberron, and even that, it's just kind of cursory knowledge. But the world of Eora, well, I'm sitting here doing this podcast. I know a lot about it. So I'm always wondering, how can I inject Eora into the fantasy RPGs that I'm playing at the table with my players? And I've talked about this before, specifically regarding Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, how you can inject Eora into that structure. And I like those episodes, but I do think that there was a little bit missing from there, a little bit, I guess, experience at the table actually doing it, because I haven't really been able to implement a long-term campaign or anything beyond a couple of sessions with some players. But Cairn, thankfully, is, I think, intuitive enough, and I also have a table that I've experienced enough that I know how they would play, that it's interesting to see how you could apply something like Eora into Cairn. But I want to go beyond just that specific game. I want to ask the question of, how do you apply Eora to a variety of potential tabletop role-playing games that might have different mechanics or different approaches or different philosophies, etc., or even different tonal focuses? Because I think Eora offers a lot of different variety. If you're playing a fantasy game that's on the high seas with pirates and stuff like that, then you have the game that can be set in the Deadfire Archipelago. If you have a game that's going to be set in some sort of magical forest where there are different creatures, you can go in the Deerwood. So there's a vast array of settings allowed, but there's also a vast array of magic allowed in Eora as well, because you have people who are accessing magic through a grimoire and they're casting more wizard-like spells, but then you have people who are using magic in the ambient environment around them, stirring the collective memory that's just beyond the reach and the in-between, between the here and the now, where people go after they die. There's a lot of ways you can interpret the magic and how it's applied. And I think especially with OSR games, having that little bit of leeway and vagueness, if you wanted to have it, can be helpful in games like that. Not that Pillars of Eternity or Avowed are vague in their rulings. I think, if anything, Pillars of Eternity is very definitive, much closer, I think, to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. But for those who are playing games not Dungeons & Dragons, are there ways that you can inject Eora into it? And I think that there definitely is, if you have a base idea of what's important about the world. So I'll be using Cairn as kind of like my go-to example, because it's the one I'm using right now, but I'm going to try to keep this as broad as possible. When it comes to the world of Eora, the thing that I think is most important with the particular characters that your players are going to create is where they are from, not so much what they are. But that is interesting and important as well. If you are playing an Orlin, which is the more diminutive character, the small hairy guy with lots of with really big ears, there's the potential for racial discrimination to occur, and that's something to think about if that's something your table is comfortable with. Whereas if you're playing something like a Mauan, which is supposed to be very, big and broad type of character, they would naturally have a bit more strength or constitution if that matters in your game. But by and large, what's most important for the backstory and the flavor of your character is where they are from and what they did. Not so much the class they have. I think the classes in Pillars, or even the class that you can create in Avowed, are expressions of these people, of who they already were. And so having a base understanding about where you're going to host the game, I think is be important if you're going to play a tabletop game in Eora. So if you're going to do a swashbuckling pirate-themed adventure in whatever system you're running it in, be a little familiar with the Deadfire Archipelago and the factions within, depending on what time in the history of the world you're there. The native tribes that exist in the Deadfire Archipelago are the Huana. Are you there during the time of the Deadfire game when the Royal Deadfire Company and the Valiant Trading Company are there vying for power and control? That kind of a thing. But if you're looking for more of a magical forest type thing, then you're going to want to be familiar with the Deerwood or the Living Lands and the factions that are played there. But where you are and where your characters come from are a little bit more important. This can be a bit difficult if you're at the table, especially if you're going to want to run something in Eora with players that is, just going to be a one-shot, because then you have this entire world of lore that you're trying to bring forward for characters that maybe aren't going to be there for a while, or we don't know if this is going to turn into a long-term campaign. But that really is, I think, what's more important about the characters is where they're from. If they're from Rawatai, that informs the kind of culture and upbringing they had than if they were from the White That Wins. But when in doubt, I suppose you can always fall back on the stuff that you already know. If you're listening to this podcast, you've probably played Pillars of Eternity 1 or 2, or you've played Avowed, and I think you could very easily jump into either of those settings with what you're familiar with. Personally speaking, as much as I really enjoy Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 from a role-playing perspective for tabletop games, in the particular game of Cairn, which I've been really into, I think the Living Lands is actually a really suitable setting for Cairn. So in the game of Cairn, there's this kind of default setting called Avowed, where the forest is magical and dangerous and combat is not balanced. There's this kind of otherworldly realm called the Roots that is connected to the forest. There's a whole bunch I'm glossing over because it's not really the purview of this podcast, but there's a lot about the themes and tones of Cairn that I think can come from the Living Lands in terms of not just the lore, but the setting as well. And so if I was a person who had only played Avowed, I think I could take a lot of the experiences from that game and bring it forward. I could say, okay, you're a person who is from the Living Lands, and you as a player from there who played the video game, you're a little more familiar. You might just want to ask people, what part are you from? Are you from Shatterscarp and Thirdborn, or are you from the Emerald Stair in the city of Fiorme of Verano kind of thing? You could ask something like that. So easily you could restrict the scope of where characters can be from to this small locale, especially if the players aren't as familiar with the world at large. But where you're from and what they do matter. In games like Cairn, which are classless, I also think that really lends well to something like Avowed related. And so I'm kind of really tempted, personally speaking, to try to take the setting of Living Lands as we see in Avowed and kind of inject that into the game of Cairn, or maybe it's the other way around where I'm injecting Cairn into the Living Lands. Because again, I think, especially as a GM, having this knowledge, bring it to the table just makes that much better of an experience for the players. As much as I talked last time when I was into the Dungeons and Dragons mode about the statistics, like might and dexterity, constitution, resolve, perception, and intellect, those are important, and I think that it's fairly intuitive to be able to transfer those others to games where those are applicable. In games like Cairn or OSR games or other games where there's maybe only one statistics, then I think it's still kind of fairly intuitive on which ones actually matter and how you can apply those in. And most of the time, I think you can just run with the system that you're going with. In Cairn, for example, you have strength, dexterity, and willpower, and you're just rolling 3d6 to generate what that is. I don't think you need to worry about transferring might or dexterity or perception or resolve from the Pillars world into this. I think you can just use the system that they have in play. If you want to replace one of the words with something from the games just to make it like it has that same feel, then obviously go ahead. Another thing to consider, though, about your characters and the world that you're in when it comes to the World of Eora for tabletop is not just where are these people from in the setting and scope that you have, but also what is it that they do? How do they interact with essence? Now, essence, as I've talked about on other episodes, is how people do magic in this world, and it's the stuff that souls are made out of. Your body is made out of, carbon, and souls are made out of essence. That's just kind of how it is. But essence also makes up more than just the soul of you as a person. It also is infused into every living object that is around. And even in the ambient environment, kind of floating in the air in a sort of half ethereal realm all around you. Again, I'm glossing over the particulars of it, but we're just going to leave it at that for now. How your characters interact with essence is, I think, important for how your characters are building their player characters for a tabletop game. And when it comes to magic, you want to use this idea of a focus. Having a spellcasting focus is really like, what is the conduit from what you are using to perform your magics? When it's wizards, their focus, in a sense, is their grimoire. It's used as an in-between between the caster and the source of essence, and it actually shapes the spell that the caster then throws. If you're a chanter in the World of Eora, you are chanting some historical event that stirs the memory that's in the ambient essence around you, and then that essence kind of reenacts that in the actual world around you, and that's how the chanters are, in a sense, casting their spell. A cipher uses another person's soul as their focus, and that's why a lot of their magic has to do with psionics and, mind-based attacks. And so that's something to consider when you are transferring Eora into a tabletop system, is how are we interacting with magic? How are we using essence, which is in everything around us? And how is it a character can interact with that essence to perform magical abilities? And I think open up to your table would be a smart idea, because some of them will come up with some really interesting ideas on how they can do that. Or they might already have an idea on the kind of character they want. If they want to play a druidic type character, then you're going to start thinking, okay, how does this character interact with the essence that is found in nature? How do they have this natural connection to essence that is found in the trees and the rocks and the grass and the air, whereas other people have connections to different sources of essence, such as their own soul, and bolstering that? If you're playing a game that has specific classes, you can read up on those classes and obviously compare them against the classes that exist in Pillars of Eternity and see if any line up in a close sort of way. But if you're playing a game that is classless, then it really opens up wide to just how does the character interact with essence. Another thing to think about within the world of Eora on a grand scale are the deities of this world. At the time of Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 and the time of Avowed, the gods of the world are a fairly important part, and the 11 deities that exist within the pantheon are pretty universally talked about. Now, as we saw in the game of Avowed, they don't have to be a heavy-handed topic in order for you to have a game in the world of Eora, even though I was a little disappointed by that. It does show that despite the fact that they are present everywhere and they should be mentioned at least in some way, you don't have to make them a huge focus. They just have to kind of be flavored in there in some way. But you should still, if you're going to be a GM especially, be very familiar, or at least, have a cursory knowledge of the different gods, or the few that you might involve and how they could be involved, or how a religious or fanatical cult of that god might be involved as well. Because these gods and the religions that they form are fairly universal across the known world of Eora, at least at the time of these games being played. But as for the rest of it, most of it I think will probably be handled by character creation in whatever system you're playing in. You might have to reskin some of the available races, or if a game doesn't have a lot of available races, you just have to find a way to represent these racial choices as just different versions of human beings in a sense. When it comes to classes versus classless, you have the source material from Pillars of Eternity and Avowed to kind of go off of. Avowed is a classless game, Pillars of Eternity is a classed game, and so you can kind of use those ideas to bounce off of, and there's more than enough information on the internet that you can use to have all this all this data right in front of you. I mean, you can go in and play the games and you can read spells off the game, but you can also just go on the fandom and read all the wizard spells in the fandom if you're wanting to get inspiration there. I think the next big topic that you would have to consider is animancy. Animancy is the science of essence, which is the stuff souls are made of. And so how can animancy be used in the world that these players are playing in, whether it's a big topic or not? If you're going to find people who have opinions about animancy, whether it's a science that should be regulated or should be outlawed or freely researched, and then different research projects that can happen. How can we tether the soul to the body so that no one ever dies? How can we read into the past lives of the soul so we know what this person may or may not have done in the past life? How can we fix soul maladies for souls that are broken or, for a lack of a better word, sick? What kind of different experiments? Can we use essence, whether it's a soul of a person or just the essence that is found within nature? Can we infuse essence into things to make it more potent? We see this in Avowed, where they are trying to use essence from the living lands itself to create agricultural technology and have better crops as a result. Or you see someone who is trying to animate the undead and then turn them basically into farmhands. There's a lot of different ways that you could do this, especially when it comes to areas of the undead. But remember that souls, if we're dealing with souls in experimentation, also have personality and memory behind them as well. And then the last thing that I'm going to have here that is worth mentioning is Adra. Adra is a unique substance that exists within the world of Eora, and these stone pillars that you can find scattered throughout the entirety of the world. The really interesting, unique thing about Adra is that it can conduct essence, like electricity through copper wire. So essence is used, Adra is used a lot in animancy experiments because you can transfer essence from one place to another, or you can house essence inside of it. But Adra can also be used as gems, for gemstone making and all that, jewelry, but it's also really important in the cycle of reincarnation that exists within this world, because Adra pillars are the conduit by which souls that have left recently deceased bodies, Adra is the conduit that these souls go to in order to travel to the beyond, which is essentially the afterlife. And then the Adra is also how those souls get back into our mundane physical world, into a new body, thus creating a new person. And so Adra is a really important part of the world, and there should be some sort of involvement with them as well.
If you find your trail has run cold, come to me with whatever you have. There is much I may be able to do for you.
And so those, I think, are kind of the major things to think about. There's a lot of other secondary things. You can look into specific factions depending on where you're playing the game. You could also look into different dungeons or how you can create ruins for your players to explore. If you're in the Deerwood, then you're going to have a lot of Engwithan ruins, whereas if you're playing in the Living Lands, you're going to have a lot of godless ruins. And so you can flavor things that way, but you can also just create dungeons for factions that may or may not have been there for a while. You don't need to have a thoroughgoing knowledge of all this other stuff. But I think the 5 or so things that I've mentioned here in broad topics, those are the most important ones if you are going to run something in Eora in whatever system that you're playing in. That's the thing that you can really talk about, or that you should know about to bring it to the table to adapt it to whatever system you're playing. And I've practiced it with a few different systems, and despite the fact that I've sat here for almost 20 minutes talking about this, it doesn't take much longer than the episode of this podcast to actually see intuitively how to put Eora into most fantasy systems. Obviously, I don't have a thoroughgoing knowledge of every fantasy system that's out there, but I have played around with enough different tabletop role-playing games to kind of get a gist of how a lot of different styles can work. And I've also worked with a lot of people who have put Eora into their games, and it's a fairly intuitive process. So if you listen to the length of this episode, then you also have the time to be able to do that. It is a bit intimidating for some, especially who are new game masters. That can be an intimidating process, but I think it is also a good opportunity to practice that and flex those muscles and get better at that kind of a thing, if that's something you're interested in doing. I think the World of Eora is a great place to host a tabletop role-playing game, and if you're listening to a podcast like this, you probably will be able to get a decent amount of knowledge, if you enjoy this podcast, to be able to learn enough about the world that you can present a well-informed set of knowledge to your table, which will be better for your players in the long run as well. Now, you might be wondering what all this has to do with teleportation, and it's just specifically with the topic of Cairn, and this is just one example I'm going to give for you. I'm going to give you a warning right now, though. There is a little bit of spoilers here, because I kind of have to talk about an inciting event that has to do with the topic of teleportation. So if you're worried about any potential spoilers for Pillars of Eternity or Avowed, I'm not going to say which one, then perhaps jump off if you haven't finished any of those games. But so you have been warned. Now, despite the fact that I have given this spoiler warning, it's not a huge spoiler. It's just something that we witness within the game. Anyways, so teleportation is something that has been brought up in the world, and the reason I'm talking about it here is because I want to use Cairn as a specific example for a game that you can introduce Eora into. Now, I've done this with Dungeons & Dragons already, and the reason I'm doing it with Cairn is because it's such a very different style of RPG in a fantasy setting. Now, granted, Cairn is a low fantasy setting, which I think kind of matches Pillars of Eternity in some senses, but definitely not in its entirety. And then it was an interesting system for me to sit down and actually write in the Eora setting into this world, especially when it got to the area of what's called the Roots. So in the game of Cairn, there is this section in the lore labeled the Roots, and they are essentially this part of the magical wood underneath the magical wood, and this part of the world is where like time, matter, and space start to not necessarily be governed by the laws of nature as we know them. It's an unknowable world by its nature. It's dangerous, and it's nearly impossible to access. You actually have to find a thing called a gate and open it, and after you open a gate you cannot close it, and then that access to the Roots is now possible, and monsters can come out of the Roots into the magical forest. There's a whole bunch of really cool stuff about Cairn that I love, and I had to like twist the flavor a little bit of it in order to get Eora in there. But one thing that became kind of clear to me, and this is the fun part of being a GM doing this kind of stuff, is how can I have something like the Roots exist in a world like the World of Eora? Because there isn't this vast underground network of caverns or these giant trees and magical forests that have created Roots into almost metaphysical plane of existence where physics doesn't matter anymore. That doesn't really exist in the World of Eora. So do I just ignore this default lore from Cairn? It's definitely an option, right? Like, you don't have to spoon everything from the default setting of a game system you're playing in into your new setting. That's the whole point of you using a new setting. Me, I like the challenge of it, and it also just helps me keep the information focused, especially since the Roots are also a really important part of the design of Cairn. And so I do like to try to keep those elements. But again, it's not necessary to do. But thankfully, with the World of Eora, we have something kind of similar, and that is this giant Audra network that exists within this world. I'd mentioned in this episode that you use Audra as kind of a conduit for souls. When a person dies, the soul leaves the body that the soul goes to the Audra, and it travels through this Audra network that is connected throughout the entirety of the planet, mostly, and goes to the beyond. But it doesn't have to necessarily just go to the beyond, right? It could go to maybe other places, whether that's physical or ethereal, perhaps. I guess I would leave up to you as the GM, but the idea that you could perhaps open up some sort of gate into this metaphysical realm that doesn't necessarily follow the same rules of physics in the normal world, that's not out of the realm of question in the World of Eora, and that lines up a lot with the flavor of what we see in Cairn. The reason I want to bring this up is because normally teleportation isn't accessible magic within the World of Eora. In fact, I would describe the World of Eora's magic as very local. I think that's the big difference between magic like in Dungeons & Dragons and with Pillars of Eternity, is the magic in Pillars of Eternity is very localized. You don't have ascending, you don't have message, you don't have wish, you don't have teleport or anything like that. You know, you have things that are within the immediate area that you can usually see with your eyes, and that's about as far as you can go with the magic. Perhaps out of some, outstanding examples within the games themselves, but we aren't really privy to how that magic works as player characters. We just kind of witness it. But regardless. And that was also a really fun part about adapting Eora into the game of Cairn, because Cairn's magic that we have in the game is very much non-offensive focused. The spells that you see in the player's guide are all very much just, I'm not utilitarian, but they're very much interesting things, like you can stretch your body up to 10 feet in any direction. There's not a lot of you cast a fireball that does d6 damage. It's a lot of you shrink your body to this, or you turn yourself into that, or you create this sensory effect, or there's a whole bunch of interesting things like that, and most of them are non-offensive spells, and I like that kind of thing. It's interesting, though, because Pillars of Eternity does have a lot of offensive spells. So I think if I was to transpose Eora into Cairn, I would try to include some of that offensive magic, which is obviously different than the game design, but I personally am okay with that. That's one of the areas where I feel confident in. And Cairn works really well in regards to where the player characters come from, because when the player characters are creating their characters, if they can specify which, empire in the world they came from, perhaps we will give them some unique options for items that come from that area. Or I might ask them, like, what is a trinket that is specific to that region? Or what kind of things do you think a person from that area might carry? Or what knowledge might they have? And that fits really well into a design for a character in Cairn. I do have to kind of do away with the religious lore that exists in Cairn because it's very specifically tied to that default setting, and we are wanting the Eoran pantheon there. But I think the important aspects of the religious settings that we see in the Cairn default setting, there are actual Eora analogs for, such as the Tideborn. The Tideborn is one religion that exists in this game of Cairn that has to do with this kind of new and uprising religion that has to do with a ritual drowning for people to enter into its clergy. And I think that you could easily justify from a couple different deities in the world of Eora, a cult that would do a very similar thing. And you could say that in these rural areas of the Deerwood, that this cult is starting to gain in popularity. So you're really able to transpose a lot of these same themes over. And that's why, just tying that all back to teleportation, it's not something that can normally happen in the game, but we do see at the end of Avowed, your character, who is in this metaphysical plane called the garden, leaving the garden via teleportation back into the, physical world over at the start of the game where we started in the first place. So teleportation is kind of possible within some means. Now, in the game of Cairn, opening a gate is supposed to be difficult. And in the world of Eora, being able to teleport through Adra is supposed to be literally impossible, and no one else has done it. So very difficult, I think, matches. And I'm not going to dive too much into more detail because then I'm just going to be fangirling about this tabletop game I'm playing about. And I think I've kind of given enough of an example of how you can transpose this into this one game as an example to show you that you really can adapt the world of Eora to whatever game you're playing. If you are playing any tabletop role-playing games out there in the fantasy genre, probably, then what would your interest be for having the world of Eora brought into that system? Is it something that you're interested in? Is it something that you would like to talk about? If so, send me an email, worldofaora@gmail.com. I have a lot of experience in this world, and I've played a lot of different tabletop role-playing games. I'm more than willing to have a conversation to help anyone out if they want to talk about that stuff. That being said, there is a wealth of knowledge from individuals on Reddit and on Discords who know way more than I do and have much more experience than I do who would also be willing to help. So yeah, even though today's episode wasn't very lore heavy, I still think that was interesting to just kind of take a lot of these concepts of lore that we talk about in this game quite a lot and see how we can apply it in different ways. Especially, now that summertime is going to start ending soon and more tabletop role-playing games are going to start popping up as people stay in homes instead of go outside as much. I think this might be something on people's radar, and I hope that they may take this idea that we can play a game in the setting of Eora, and we can put it in whatever game we're playing. And I hope some of you will consider it, and if you do, please let me know how that goes. I would love to hear how it worked for you, and actually let other people know on Discords and Reddits as well, because there's other people who are going to be interested in that as well. Send me an email, worldofaora@gmail.com if you do, or you can follow me on Twitter, by the way, if you want to know when episodes come out or if any other questions like this pop up. If you enjoyed today's episode and you'd like to support the show, you can do so at ko-fi.com/worldofaora. Or if you don't want to support the show in that particular way, which I never expect, it's just for people who want to do that kind of thing, you can support this show by engaging with the podcast platform that you're listening to this on, by giving a comment, giving a rating, giving a review, whatever your podcast platform allows, just engage with it in some way, shape, or form, and you'll really help this show reach more people, and then they can make it reach more people, and they can support the show, and that would just help out there. As for myself and what I've been playing lately, I haven't been playing Grounded 2 for the last little bit because my gaming crew and I, we kind of slowed down how much we were playing video games, and I've been diving headfirst into this tabletop game of Cairn. That's really what I've been focusing on. I've designed 3 different dungeons. I'm starting to homebrew a setting for it. I've created an analog for Eora so that we could play there if that's what my players want to do. I also have this adventure module by a guy who created a wonderful adventure called The Undying Sea by Joseph R. Lewis, and I'm really enjoying that. You technically don't need to have Cairn the game to play that, but it's nice to have both. Especially since Cairn is so affordable on Amazon. It's $5 here in Canada for me, and that was just the player's guide. The warden's guide's a few bucks more, but that's a whole game for under $20. That's amazing. But yeah, so that's what I've been doing, just designing, and writing, and I'm probably going to be doing that for a while. I sat down today to play a video game for an hour, and I didn't even know what to play. I futzed around in Night City on Cyberpunk for a while, because I always enjoy Cyberpunk, and I thought about getting into a couple other driving games or open world exploration games. I just wasn't feeling it. I just want to sit down and do role-playing game stuff right now, so that's just where I'm at. But yeah, that's everything for today's episode. Thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I've been your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and I'll see you guys next time.